Coming at you again today with a live celebration with Lauren. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, thanks.
So you and I have celebrated a whole lot. Give us a little bit of background. What are you writing and what has your journey been up until this point?
So I'm working on a YA contemporary fantasy novel, and I've been working on this book for several years. In fact, I've started to joke that it's really been like 3 different books because I've rewritten it so many times, just kind of struggling to get hold of what it was or what it is. And I've done all the different writer things, you know, gone to this conference or that conference or read this article or that article and so on and so forth. And then even here in the writing gym, since I joined a few months ago, that's where I've really started to find what I would call clarity on this project. And it's been an experimental, at a few points, you know, really like nerve-wracking process where I thought I'm just going to dive in and see how this process actually works. And it has worked wonders.
So this is something that's really kind of interesting about the writing process, right? Because, you know, if you tell someone you're a writer and they're not a writer, they might think, oh, you know, you write a book, you sit down and you write chapter 1 and then you write chapter 2 and then you write chapter 3, which seems pretty logical. And yet you and I both know intimately that's not the way that this whole thing works. So talk to us a little bit about your journey around that process of discovering the non-linear reality of creativity.
So that was how I started trying to write a book, was I'll just start with chapter 1 and I'll get all the way to the end and then it'll be all wrapped up in a nice, neat little bubble. And I did that. And what I ended up with was something that's not fit for human eyes. So, and I feel like I've tried everything in between. I always thought that I was a staunch outliner. When I came to the writing gym, that's what I would have called myself. You know, you outline rigorously and then you have a book, ta-da. But it wasn't working for me and I didn't know why it wasn't working. And so that's where the idea of pantsing really came in. But I always thought pantsing was something like I would never be able to do. It just seemed scary to me. But that's what I've been learning to do in the writing gym, is to kind of trust my brain and to trust the process and trust that the story will come out. And also that outlining does have a place in my writing process too. It's why I always felt so compelled to do it. So, and 2, I've noticed that everybody here in the writing gym really does have their own unique writing process, and that's totally okay and normal. And I've been working through a lot of different methods to finally stumble on what mine is and what works for me. And that's been the best thing ever.
That's really interesting because not only are things like chapters obfuscated, but the story itself, the character's journey, can seem like, okay, you know, we're going to get the character from point A to point B and that's my story. And yet, that's not the way that the story comes together. Tell us a little bit about what that's looked like in the course of the 3 versions of the novel.
So that first version was not fit for human eyes, like I said. And that was at a point before I understood what a character arc even was supposed to look like, or that they just existed. I thought that if I just wrote a book, it would just sort of naturally, organically be there, which is really kind of funny now. But finding the character in all the muddle of everything else is something that was really, really tricky for me at first, but is also something I feel like I've learned to do a lot better now. And one of the things that has helped me do that is kind of like pantsing. And I did this even before I realized that it was kind of like pantsing, but I interview my characters. And just sort of let them talk to me, and with no preconceptions about what they're going to say. And that's how I find out what they do have to say.
That's really interesting. And tell us a little bit about how it felt in that phase that I call the muddle of the middle, where you realized that the story was out of control and you weren't really sure what was going to happen. recently we basically deconstructed your novel. You know,
Yep.
we dumped all the puzzle pieces out on the table. So what was that experience like emotionally at the beginning, you know, before you had even started to kind of touch the pieces and figure out where they went?
So it was, I mean, it was scary at first. Less scary than it could have been, because by the time I really started to do that, I'd already been hanging around the writing gym a few weeks and had figured out that these processes that you use here really do work. Heard me rant about salons in other places, and I think that was what built the trust, I guess, in me that this was going to work. So I sort of took my big deep breath and dove off into pantsing my way all the way through this novel that I have outlined rigorously, and I mean rigorously, several times before, and come up, you know, with a blank. And I really just thought, I hope this is gonna work, and did it. And as soon as I started doing it, I knew that I'd made the right decision, because it was fun. And it had a I don't know, even before it was clear, there was this sense of this is going somewhere that wasn't there before. And when I finished that draft and I looked back at it, I was like, well, this is pretty messy. But the second that it was done, and the second that we started looking back at what was there, it was like everything finally just clicked into place. And so the last few weeks, I've been pouring out page after page after page of my novel. And it's there, and it's clear, and it's amazing.
Yeah, and I recall that one of the things you've said to me over the past 3 or so weeks that we've been working on this reconstruction, is, you know, a sense of weight lifted off of your shoulders, so much more clarity on where your characters are going, because you had been through that process, you know, in the writing gym, and working on filling in the blanks, and that you were really excited about something that in the past you would have dreaded. I think that that's a root of writer's block for a lot of people. So how did you get to a point where you were able to move like totally away from dread and into excitement, the polar opposite?
That's the magic you guys do here in the writing gym.
Absolutely. And what do you think that you needed to let go of in order to get where you are now?
The idea that it had to be a preconceived whole. I don't know where I got that idea in my head to start with, but I thought that the whole story should just basically burst into existence in one little pop, and like, there it is, all complete, and everything's there. I don't really know why I thought that, but so letting go of the idea that the whole story had to be there right from the get-go, every detail, was what has allowed me to actually get there. There have been many times where I sat and just fretted over some detail or some piece of the novel that I wasn't even at yet. Like, maybe I'm working on chapter 3 and I'm just sitting there going, oh, what's going to happen on the 7th page of chapter 9? And like, I'm not even there yet. And I would come up with what's going to happen on this 7th page of chapter 9. And then that would end up being a problem, because then I'm going back to chapter 5 and I'm like, oh, how do I make it so that exactly that thing happens on exactly that page in chapter 9, which is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And so letting go of all of that was a huge relief.
And I think that there are so many writers who are in a very similar situation to where you were, which is, you know, I don't know what the character is gonna happen to the character, or I don't have a deep enough idea of where she's gonna go and what's gonna happen to her and how she's gonna grow. So what would you say to these writers, knowing what you know now?
The fastest way that I've ever gotten those answers is not by sitting and fretting over exactly what they're going to be at every point in the story, but by just writing the story and seeing what they turn out to be. So by pantsing, I guess.
Well, and that's really powerful. You know, one of the things that we really emphasize in the writing gym is not just your manuscript, but the writer yourself, you know, you as a person, and helping you to find your best writer. So I think that you had some surprises along the way in finding your best writer, but how would you say that we helped you over in the writing gym to find your best writer?
In a million different ways. That just to be a person who repeats myself a million times, the salons for sure. Meeting regularly with Gretchen and with you as well, and being able to voice what my fears were, and having people that are so knowledgeable, so intimately knowledgeable with the industry and with how the writer's brain works, that you could pose questions in a way that I hadn't ever thought of before, and help me realize what it was that I was actually dealing with. I think the first example that comes to mind is what you were talking about a second ago, fear masquerading as writer's block. And I would have said before that I had writer's block all the time. And it never occurred to me that what I was actually dealing with was fear and frustration of not knowing that I wanted to write and knowing what I wanted to write, but not knowing how to write it. And that was revolutionary for me, because it was like, well, if I can quit being so afraid, then I can write. And that is actually what happened. So that was huge.
Yeah, it's gigantic, isn't it? I mean, it's a game changer. And it's why I set up the program the way that I set it up. And what's your experience in working with a personal trainer? Why is that a good thing to have in the program?
So there's the support, like I said, and not just like you can do it, but like really knowledgeable support. In addition to that, there's a degree of accountability. Are you doing what you said you were going to do? And if not, why not? But never in a way that's like, you better do this, but always in a way that is supportive and helpful and, about you as a writer. And it also contributes to the sense of community. All of that was really important to me.
That's an interesting point that I've never really thought about before. So in your personal experience, how is the community in the writing gym different from a writing conference or a local writing group?
Everybody here is really serious about what they're doing. And they're also really respectful about what everybody else is doing. I feel like you find people like that other places, but you also find people that aren't one or the other. And so here you really get a lot of support from the other writers. And you give support too, and that's rewarding in its own way. It just always feels like a very supportive, friendly community where you are able to voice what your concerns are and know that you're not the only one dealing with this, because that's, I think how I have felt at points in the past. And I know other writers who have felt the same way, where it's like, gosh, am I the only one that can't figure this out? And so one of the things that I found in the writing gym community is if I faced a problem, if I faced a problem, somebody else in the writing gym has faced it too. And they may already have worked out a strategy for dealing with it that then can help, me deal with it and then help somebody else deal with it later on down the road.
That's a really good point. And it's not just craft issues, but it goes a lot deeper than that, right? You're having this experience where people are talking about, I'm afraid of rejection in the way. So what is it like to sit in a virtual room, but in a room with other people who are so real about what's really happening in writing? How does that connect you to people?
Well, it's incredibly liberating, because all of the pressures, self-imposed or otherwise, to be doing what everybody else is doing goes away, because you realize everybody's doing something a little bit different and everybody's messed it up a time or two. So who cares if you mess it up this time? That's okay. That's how you get better. Did this, and there's somebody there to cheer with you about it when you succeed.
That's really interesting. What is it about the writing gym that makes it safe, that you feel like you can be open in that way?
A big part of it is that everybody here is already doing it. If others are willing to be open and to share something vulnerable about themselves, it makes it that much easier, for you to step in and be like, hey, me too.
What would you say is one of the biggest takeaways of being a member of that type of community? How has it impacted you or changed your life in some way?
Like I said before, I think the biggest part of it is feeling so much freer in my writing, and therefore connected to my writing, because I don't feel like I'm alone in it anymore. I don't feel like that if I hit a snag that it's gonna, really be a problem, because I know exactly where to go with my snag and say, hey, I got my arm caught on a branch back there. How do I get loose? And somebody's going to be like, oh, once before I got caught on a branch back there, and here's how I got loose. And it's amazing. I know where to go. I know that there are people there that are going to help me. I know that if I'm just having one of those down and out days where I'm like, my characters won't behave, and I'm the worst writer that's ever been, and the worst writer that ever will be, that I have somewhere to go and, pout about that. And somebody's going to be like, hey, I thought that yesterday. It's not true for either one of us. And it's great.
That's really amazing. And so one of the things that we're here to celebrate with you is clarity and this real breakthrough that you had. You made some illustrations of your plot arcs and your character arcs. How does it feel to be on the other side of the muddle of the middle and to have that clarity of really the clearest, wholest picture that you've ever had of your novel?
So good. I've been kind of just walking around on little clouds for the last few weeks, even as this whole thing has been unrolling. It's been an amazing, exhilarating process. Like I've described it as just kind of riding this wave of energy. I have never had anything like this happen in my writing before. It's thrilling. And I love it. I love it.
That's really interesting, because lots of writers think that they have to do it on their own. Like that's sort of the way that writing is. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a belief that some writers need to let go of. But why do you think that is, that people have this idea that like have to go it alone?
There's such an ownership of the work that we put out. It's personal to write a story, and it's personal to write a novel, and so it is kind of a vulnerable thing. And so I think maybe sometimes it is that same fear that keeps us from being vulnerable in other ways, can get in the way of our writing, because we are being vulnerable and we're pouring our soul out onto the page sometimes, as people say, and it's hard to let other people critique that. It's hard to even show it to other people sometimes. And you feel like if maybe you do let somebody else take a piece of it or help you with it, that somehow, maybe you're losing ownership of it. What I found is that's not true at all. But I think maybe that's what I thought at one point. So I'll equate it to something else too. I like to draw, and I've always been into drawing. And I used to think when I was a kid that taking an art lesson or something was, I don't know, cheating somehow, because I was naturally kind of good at drawing. And I thought, well, I just have to figure it out on my own, and then it's like mine, and I did it. And that's ridiculous. And it's the same with writing. I have found that, at no point can you ever really lose creativity or ownership of what you're producing. It's always coming from you. But when you ask somebody else to help you, you figure out how to make it come out better, how to refine it, and how to get actually down to the core of what you were trying to express in the first place. It makes it more pure somehow, and actually, to me, strengthens the sense of ownership that I have over my work.
That is an amazing insight into the writing process. Thank you for sharing that. So we've got so much to celebrate with you, Lauren. Before we celebrated your finding your writing process, then we celebrated 3 publications that you had back to back to back from prompts that you did here in the writing gym. And then now we're celebrating this moment where your novel is in view, and everything is going to happen. And we're in the revision phases, and soon we'll be moving into publishing that novel as well. So you are just, you're on fire, my friend.
It's exciting.
Thank you for celebrating with us today, Lauren.